I'm doing a series right now about how to build a mobile app. You can go and check that. It'll be over on my Saturday feed where I drop an episode every week for the next 6 weeks or so on how you as an appreneur can go and build a mobile app for your business or your app startup. What I wanted to do today is talk about platforms. I worked in phones for about 20 years, and I think it's great to have an understanding of the iPhone and Android phone as a platform for your mobile app, and to put all that in context. One of the questions I used to get asked a lot when I was contracting and consulting was, which is best? Which should I use? Should I go to iOS or should I go to Android? Like, if I'm starting a business, like maybe I like Android myself, I have an Android phone, but which one am I going to use for the purposes of my business? Well, it's a really interesting question, and there's a lot of value in digging in and answering that question for yourself, because when you commit to that, and there's a lot to be said about cross-platform apps, cross-platform development, and so on. But when you commit to a particular platform, what you're doing is niching down. It's a great way for you to focus sharply your value. So I'm going to talk today about the two platforms. Now, this is kind of a reprise of a talk that I did some time ago. I've done it a couple of times actually, talking about the span of my time working in cell phones and how during that time the cell phone as a platform for apps grew and changed. Now, there'll be a bit of history in here. There's going to be some technical content as well, so I am going to use this presentation a little bit to kind of credentialize myself, just in case with all this business talk you're wondering if I really know what I'm talking about technically. And I'm also going to try and tell a few stories, because I think that carries weight when you're trying to think about your own decision making for your app. All right, so let's get started. So I started in tech like in the late 90s. I was in New Zealand and I just finished kind of half of an architecture degree. And I moved to Australia to work in engineering with my father. But I found that I was really in demand for writing AutoCAD scripts from architecture to computing. So that was the bridge. And I jumped into a computer science degree, and I very quickly came across this incredibly powerful language called C++. It is still around, like I'm talking the 90s, but C++ is still a very powerful language today. It's the language that all of the Java JVMs are written in. And you don't need to know what that means exactly, but it's the underpinnings, it's the hard structure that's used for a lot of the tooling right down at the base layer. So the kernels of phone systems are often written in this. For example, the Linux kernel that powers the Android phone, written in C++. Apple's iOS system, even though we write code in modern languages like Swift and Objective-C, there's a bridge and you can write C++. In fact, you can actually write cross-platform apps in C++. Now, I wanted to become a guru at C++. That was my goal. I thought, you know what? It's the late 90s, the internet is booming, there's like computers are getting smaller and smaller. They're miniaturizing into devices, and pretty soon, you know what? It's going to be crazy. We'll be able to carry them around in our hand. So I thought C++ is where it's at. So I finished my degree, and I wound up working for a company called Trolltech, who used Linux. If you've not heard of Linux, it's an open source operating system. You've got your Windows, you've got your Mac, and then Linux is an operating system all on its own. that was built by some folks in Europe mostly, and it also included some software by collaborators all over the world, including folks like Richard Stallman, and they all collaborated together to build this open source community around Linux. Now, just because it's open source doesn't mean you can't make money out of it, and a lot of folks do. So the company I was working for, we were building gadgets like pages, like medical devices, and a phone. So in 2006, we shipped a phone called the Green Phone. We'd already built the Sharp Zorus, which was a personal digital assistant. And that thing, at the time, like pen-based computing, it was pretty popular. Now, the Sharp Zorus meant, it was a phase, it belonged in a certain time, but it kind of led to the introduction of the touch screen. The phone that we built at Trolltech was called the Green Phone. It did actually have a keyboard, but around the same time, two powerful forces were coalescing. What's interesting is that at this time, Nokia was the big player, and they had their operating system called Symbian. And what was expected to be the common wisdom of how you got an app onto a Nokia phone, it was a thing called the Java applet. And that came from web technologies. So you had a web browser, like, Firefox or whatever, and you wanted to run a piece of software inside that web browser. So what did you do? You loaded up this secure context. And there was the common limited device context, or, these various mid is a kind of it sounds like skibbity mid. It was a bit mid, but it was another profile for running apps. And this alphabet soup led to a lot of problems. Like, not only was there compatibility issues, but anytime you wanted to do anything inside this little secure context of the Java applet on a Symbian phone, you ran into all these problems. But nonetheless, at that time with, the good old Snake game and some of the other games on phones back in those days, that Java screen, that loading screen that came up, that became synonymous with having fun on your phone. So those were great days, but it was kind of a what the actual F moment, and we needed a new way. So when the phone that we built shipped, I wound up going around the world doing a few talks about it. We were in the throes of being acquired by Nokia, but I got an invite from some folks at Google, and long story short, in 2007, I flew over to Silicon Valley and transferred my entire life in a shipping container to go and work at the headquarters of Google in Mountain View. While I was there, it was kind of amazing. The photo in the bottom right here shows Google's HQ right near Moffett Field, and you can see the big blimp there from Moffett Field flying overhead. I had a sort of Melrose style place style apartment that I was living in right in Mountain View, California itself on the left-hand side. And that's the car park of Google, which right back in 2007 was full of crazy electric cars, like this little skinny one-person electric vehicle that you can see there. It's actually plugged into the solar panels up overhead at Google. Arriving there was like alien technology. The things that Google was doing back in 2007 were really amazing, and I was right in my element. I actually went to a presentation by a guy called Andy Rubin about the new Android phone. You can see it down the bottom of the screen there, showing 1208. That was the kind of phone they were looking at back then. And what Rubin talked about was his startup had been acquired by Google, and of course he went to work for Google. He'd built his stack on top of a whole lot of open source components, and it was very similar in a way to what we were doing with the green phone back at Trolltech. So I was so excited about this. I was familiar with the stack. There was still quite a lot of proprietary components back then, because you needed a storage driver, for example, that storage layer where you're going to put files on the flash system of the phone. How are you going to secure it? Well, there were still two different models. You could go the Java route, where you run the entire application space of the phone in kind of a Java layer to secure it. And that would have been a great way, of course, to run third-party apps. But it also meant that if you had something like the clock on your phone in that Android operating system, that clock didn't need to run with all of the full privileges, because you could lock it down using the Java security model. So interestingly, about the same time, we had the launch of the iPhone, and originally a lot of those colder climates, you can sort of see them up the top there. Finland is right up there, where the folks from Nokia they were working on their first phones. They were like, you know what, you can't make a touch screen for a phone. That's crazy, because everybody's going to have gloves on and they won't be able to operate it. They need keys. The BlackBerry, that was common wisdom at the time. I haven't got a picture of it on screen. But the folks behind the BlackBerry, like Jim Balzilli, famously said that, the iPhone was just a toy. But I tell you what, behind the scenes, all of the engineers at all of these different companies, including Android, were racing, talking in desperate tones to all of their engineers, having huddles about how can we replicate what Apple has done with these phones. Now, the thing is, Apple is a consumer electronics company. Their goal is to ship iPhones, to ship pieces of electronics. And to do that, they want to make it look great. They want to make it work, because once you have a piece of consumer electronics go out the door from the factory, pretty hard to change. So they spent a lot of time in testing labs where you've got the sloping glass, and they bring in everybody from truck drivers and oil rig workers and, folks who work at a desk all day, and they sit them down and they try different sizes and shapes of icons and how we're going to work this interface so that people can actually operate this phone and feel like, hey, this is my phone. It's personal to me. I love this thing. It does what I want. How can we capture that feeling? So Apple spent all this time. It's all a big secret, of course, and then they finally launch it. And it was a simple solution, these round-cornered icons. But of course, everybody was like, oh, I could have thought of that. And of course, Android, they were racing to try to do the same thing. So they quickly pivoted, produced a phone in working alongside their partners in Asia to produce these new handsets. And credit to them, they pivoted and produced, the first Android handset, like you can see at the bottom there, in 2008, when Andy Rubin gave his talk at Charlie's Cafe in Mountain View, California. I was sitting there in the audience and watched him. Afterwards, I went up and actually asked him, I said, hey, Mr. Rubin, can I have a job? Because I was kind of building phones on Linux for 4 years. Not so much. I didn't get my job. I was kind of cranky that he wouldn't even really talk to me, but as it turned out, I don't think it was such a great idea. If you go and Google for Andy Rubin right now, things didn't work out so great for him, even though the Android phone itself has been a huge success. So what happened after that? You had these two incredible but very diverse operating systems. Apple was focused on shipping consumer electronics handsets. They wanted you to go into a store and buy them. Why was Google shipping these phones? And you had this clash because Eric Schmidt, he was on the board of both Google and, well, he was CEO of Google and on the board with Apple. And they sort of thought, well, look, Apple won't really mind if we go and start producing phones, even though we kind of copied some of their moves with, putting icons and stuff, even though they kind of made their launcher a bit different. Well, it turns out that Apple really did mind. They got upset. There was some lawsuits flying around. And there was a lot of decisions that were made in the Google ecosystem. For example, what eventually became the Android runtime was basically a layer of Java security that was used to launch user space applications on the Android phone. That meant that the App Store ecosystem was kind of a lot different on Android. And Android was also a commodity operating system. What do I mean by commodity? Well, it's kind of a bit like Microsoft's operating system for PCs. It's meant to run on as many computers as possible. So I actually wound up working for Nokia later, and we went to a lot of different chip manufacturers in France and Europe, and they used Android as a bring-up system. What does that mean? Well, they would get a stripped back Android operating system that didn't have all the phone stuff, just had like kind of the runtime, and they would use that to actually have something on the new chips as they were testing them out to make sure that all their chip design had actually worked out how they wanted. And Android has that open source credential with it. It was a lot of its components worked on by the community over the years. But it was still needed to have basically some reference hardware. It needed a guide. So Google tried to kind of get out of that at first. They did wind up producing their Nexus line of phones, but really what they wanted people to do was to say, hey, look, we've got all this Android software, it's been proven to work, take it and run with it. But it turned out that really what was necessary was for Google to step in and take a strong lead there. So they did wind up partnering with Samsung and other various providers, and then finally, coming out with their own series of Nexus phones, just to be able to say, look, this is how you should create a phone software stack if you want to be able to say that it is a full-on Android device. So different mentalities. Google's profit motive, I don't know if this is obvious, it should be, but Google is an advertising company. The vast bulk of its revenue comes from adverts in search results. So what they were worried about was if Apple's iPhone became hugely popular, or the BlackBerry, or any other phone for that matter, they did not want them just making a decision and saying, look, no more Google searches on our phone. So basically by producing the Android operating system and giving it away for free, and also by nurturing this ecosystem, what Google was trying to do was just make sure that there was no way that these handheld devices could suddenly wind up squeezing out a huge proportion, because like the entire population went to mobile in this decade. And a lot of the developing world, India, Indonesia, a lot of places in Asia, they just leapfrogged the rollout of internet that we saw in the 90s in the Western world. They leapfrogged that and just went straight to cell phones. So they had towers and folks were just using the internet via their phone. So Google did not want to be squeezed out of that. So two completely competing and opposite types of phones. Around this time, Nokia was really kind of struggling. It was a difficult time. I left Google. I was ultimately not able to get a job in Android, and I wound up getting an offer from Nokia to work on a Linux-powered smartphone called the N9. And this was Nokia's attempt to sort of get back in the race with a Linux-powered smartphone. Now, it was a great phone. I carried one of these around. I went to Linux conferences with my Linux-powered phone, and people were like, "Oh, you're so terrible. You've got a Windows phone." And I was like, "No, dude, this is a Linux phone. Everything about this is open source," and Nokia was paying for us to build open source software on top of Linux. It was a completely free operating system of their own. It wasn't Android. And they poured everything into it. But unfortunately, it was very difficult. They really struggled to move fast enough. And at the time, we had this phenomenon of the app ecosystem. The very first iPhone app ecosystem that came about was actually using JavaScript-based apps hosted inside of the mobile version of Safari. Now, Apple wanted to be able to have very, very secure apps on their phone, but there's a big problem. Why do you care so much about security? Well, one of the things that I will talk a lot about as I go forward in this course about how to be an appreneur is that phones are, number one, trusted, and the second thing is they're personal. So those two things make them very, very powerful. I trust my phone with my banking. It's personal because it travels with me everywhere. It knows where I am. It's got all my preferences, my contacts, and I trust it to look after that information. So Apple understood this relationship between folks and their phones. I remember being in Silicon Valley when the iPhone was first rolling out, and you'd see folks on street corners just doing this, "Oh my God, look, I can slide this thing and it opens up." And Larry Ellison, famously the head of Oracle Corporation, he came back to Oracle one day with his iPhone, and the first thing he did was he said to the engineers in the building, "I want this to work with our Wi-Fi right now. Why doesn't it work?" And folks had some reasons right up until they got fired. And then the next thing, it had to work with their mail server. But Ellison knew that this was the next big thing. Apple had been working on the iPhone for years in secret, and then they kept things secret as they rolled out new versions. They do that for a reason. Again, it is consumer electronics. They're not keeping secrets because they're sort of some sketchy, dodgy, spooky group. They just don't want to roll out something that's not going to work. They don't want people in the tech press taking photographs of stuff that just is never going to make it out into the world. So when you get those Apple products, typically they're pretty well researched. So how to keep it personal, how to keep it secure and trusted, but still run these third-party apps. Apple came up with something called the sandbox. And the way the sandbox worked is actually very similar to the security system that I built, coding it in C++ and using a lot of kernel security modules. That's a lot of technical mumbo-jumbo, but it basically translates to like a hardware system that's baked in right down towards the silicon that is going to prevent apps from having extra privileges that they don't need. And by locking in that sandbox around the app, so that when the app calls out and tries to access perhaps the file system or the network, it's only going to get a small window onto those things. And that is going to be controlled by the actual kernel of the operating system. Contrast that with Android. The idea with Android was we're going to use the Dalvik runtime, which later became the Android runtime, which is basically very similar to those old school Symbian phones with their applet security controls. So very different, but provided a similar type of security, but it meant that there was no common way to produce apps for both systems. And, that suited Apple just fine. Unfortunately, with sort of a third ecosystem, Nokia really struggled, and N9 was a swan song. It did serve as a very useful experimentation platform, and again, I did a lot of flying around the world to places that were using this operating system for things like entertainment systems in the back of aeroplane seats and other types of medical machines and so on. Still used like that today. Now, around that time, Qt was actually on sale as a cross-platform system for building apps. And I have a demo which I will link elsewhere in the show notes about Qt. And it was one of the first really binary high-performance cross-platform. So what do I mean by cross-platform? What does it mean? It's basically one code base, one collection of work done by engineers, and then you can compile it for this platform and you can compile it for that platform. Seems like a no-brainer, right? Well, there are some problems with cross-platform, and there's far too much to talk about with cross-platform in this particular talk, but I will address cross-platform a bit later. The thing is, if you use a high-performance framework like Qt or some others, you can get good performance. There's not a mediating layer that's going to suck the performance out of the system. But there are a lot of gaps and problems with trying to expose the differences. Like, for example, say on iOS, you want to take a picture with a camera, so you've got to call one API. On Android, that's a completely different system. So those two APIs are actually looking very different to that programmer. So in that single code base, suddenly you've got to split it and have different behavior. It was heady times. On the left of your screen, you can see Barcelona. I was flying around a lot. You can see in the bottom right there's me. I actually ate way too much food at that time. But I was talking here in Munich about Qt or Qt, and it was, pretty powerful avant-garde system. We were using OpenGL, which is a way to accelerate graphics and to use special chips. Today, OpenGL chips had been pressed into a new role, really, because they're now used heavily in AI. Well, it came time for me to get out of Nokia. Unfortunately, poor old Nokia did wind up letting huge numbers of my friends go. There was about 50 engineers in the Brisbane office who were all released. And I went out into the business world, tried to set up my own gig, and I created my own startup. I was building my own apps. I built several of them. One of the first ones I did was called Plistinator, and you don't need to know too much about it, apart from my terrible artwork of the icon that I built for it. But it used C++. Remember, I was talking about that language. That's the language behind Qt, and it made a cross-platform app that ran on Windows, it ran on Mac, and it ran on Linux. I'm talking about the desktop now, and it was used for actually editing a particular type of file called a plist, and those plists are used by Apple devices to store data. So, for example, you plug your iPhone into your Windows desktop, it's going to leave a bunch of plist files. What if you want what's in that data? Well, my app was designed to get that data out. Some of my clients even included private investigators, but basically anyone who wanted to hack their data. So I sold that for a while. It still produces a steady little income, and it was one of my forays outside of working for Nokia and Trolltech, where I got heavily into cross-platform apps. I learned a lot. One of the big things is that the cost of releasing new versions of the app every time Windows or Mac or Linux, every time something changes, you've got 3 times the cost. And it just, the promise of one code base really is not something that's going to deliver. And it doesn't wind up being 1/3 of the work at all. I would say it's probably close to just the same amount of work. I built a lot of other apps. I built a kind of an educational mobile game. You can see there that unscrambling the word Martian there in my game for iOS. We didn't release this one on Android. And another game, Spacebot Alpha in the bottom right. I just want to talk a little bit about these 2 platforms now. Why would I know how to ship apps on both iOS and Android. Now we're left with kind of 2 platforms. Why would I ship only on iOS? Why would I do that? Well, the thing is about the cell phone as a platform is it's not just the technology. It's not just the APIs. It's not just the stack. It's not just whether you personally as an entrepreneur happen to like iPhones or Android phones. It's about your customer. So what kind of phone does your customer have? Well, oftentimes for a premium mobile app where you want somebody to actually sort of pay some money, it's really going to be about the iPhone. So in the app on the left of the screen there, we've got that 12 button in the bottom right. When you press that, you use up a hint. And when you get to the point where you've run out of hints, I have a little in-app store that would pop up. And that would give you the opportunity to buy more hints. So I'm monetizing the app using in-app purchases. Apple has its very own stack for in-app purchases. That's completely different from the Android one. But that wasn't the only reason why I decided not to produce this app. I already had the artwork. I could have done it. Well, I didn't want to do it because Android folks are very different in the way they use their phone. A lot more, there's a way more Android users. But that huge collection of Android users often have lower end devices. They're spread all around the world and speak a huge plethora of languages. And they're also very value conscious. So those folks are really looking to use some kind of advertising supported system. Some of them will even spend time trying to hack their phones and figuring out ways to route around that Dalvik system or the Android runtime that's trying to use some sort of hack to actually get free power-ups and all the rest of it. Now for me, I was running a very small startup at the time, and I knew that I was really looking for that premium customer, looking for a phone they could give to their kids to play an educational game. So it probably wasn't going to be the Android phone. I had to look at the business case for this device and figure out where those customers of mine are going to be. So the real answer to the question about Android or iOS is, where is your customer? Now obviously for apps that are going to be a very, very broad base app where you maybe have an online service that the app is just simply a portal into. You could imagine, for example, something like Canva, like that's kind of remotely located, and you build up your store of premium assets and you can use them in a design. So you're going to have a membership to do that. So what you want is large numbers of people, and you want that saturation across the market. If you're targeting individually a smaller section of the market, then you might want to choose a free platform for a particular kind of target market. Another thing to think about with this is, I would always get my app development clients saying to me, "Oh, look, I just want to go everywhere. I just need my app to spread as far as possible." That's a really big problem, because the more you spread your app, the more support you have to give. The more you spread your app, the more you have to translate it, the more time zones you're covering, and the more feedback you're going to get from all around the world when people have some kind of problem with it. So my suggestion to you would be niche down. Niche your app down, smaller and smaller, until you've got a target market that you can saturate with the value prop that you have inside of your app. Now, my app here on the left, it was a game, so all of the value was actually in the palm of your hand. Didn't really need to connect to the network. Now, it did have some features where you could go to a leaderboard, race against your friends to get higher up and everything. Obviously, that used the internet, but you could play this game without connecting to the internet. Whereas some other apps really do require the internet, and there's something quite different. So you need to think about, where is the value and how am I going to extract that value from my customer? That is another whole lecture I'm going to do much later, a talk called How Does My App Work with My Business, where I discuss some of those things. But for now, thinking about the App Store and the Google Play Store, you need to basically wrap your head around this idea that I need to go down to a niche and I need to think about what's going to happen when my app hits the App Store or the Google Play Store. Now, there's some differences between apps and websites, and again, I'll be talking about that very soon in a different talk. But there's that cycle. You develop the code, your team ships it out the door up to the App Store as an update, and then your folks download it. Now, you can have a premium app, which people pay money for. There's all kinds of different possible apps. And then on the other side, obviously, you've got web apps. Apple doesn't really like you to have something that should have been a web app and it's sitting there on the App Store, clogging it up, taking up space. Now, for a while, that was true only of Apple, but now Google has the exact same idea. They don't want web apps clogging up their store either. But for Apple, it's like, okay, people are paying $2,000 for the top-end iPhone. When they open it up and go to the App Store, they want to find trusted premium content. They might be paying $40 for some painting application, or $100 for a top premium photo editing app. So this is what the App Store is about. It's about supporting that premium experience that iPhone customers expect when they buy a $2,000 iPhone. So I did a lot of work during that time. Here's me speaking at the Mobile Games Forum in Seattle, and at Indiecade in California, in San Francisco. And I flew around all around the world, like, for Nokia, so I was comfortable speaking in front of these audiences. And, I was really trying hard to build that audience for my app. But it is really, really difficult. I think at the time when I built some of my subsequent startups, I had my startup Sortle, which I've mentioned, that used TensorFlow and OpenCV to provide image recognition, artificial intelligence, and basically human meaning for photographs. All of these business cases, you'd think by now I would understand how to run a business that used cell phone technology and actually make it a huge success. Well, it turns out to be one of the hardest things to do. And my advice really would be, after all these years, you need to start with your business plan first. Everybody thinks, well, I'll just, ship my app and folks will love it. They will download it. It just doesn't work like that. You really got to think about it, turn it on its head and say, well, the App Store is really a channel. The technology is just a platform for the value proposition that I am trying to deliver with my business. So you've got to come up with that business plan first. And if the business plan includes people will download my app, will they? Well, I flew all around the world trying to get people to download my app. Talked in all kinds of presentations, and we had ads, and we had our community manager doing social media. It all just winds up falling on deaf ears unless you've got that absolutely knockout business plan. And unfortunately, what happened for me was we wound up spending all the runway that we had, and eventually, unfortunately, had to shutter that business, and I had to go back into consulting, which I don't mind. I don't mind building apps for people. I'm pretty good at it. But the point of it all is that the iPhone and the Android phone are two completely different platforms. And I think if I want you to take anything away from this presentation, it's just be very, very wary of any system that promises to wallpaper over those two differences. You saw in those previous slides, you've got these figures of tech history like Andy Rubin and Eric Schmidt and Steve Jobs. These guys designed their systems to be completely different. You've got something that's all about advertising, all about commodity, all about going all across the world. And then you've got something that's about supporting a premium consumer electronics play. And totally different APIs, totally different market, totally different group of people. So that's one thing. The second thing is your business plan needs to focus down to a niche of which of those markets suits. You can always go to the other market later if you want to have a play on both platforms. But don't just assume that, you know what, mobile apps, mobile schmaps, they're all the same. I'll just go to the both. So I hope that's been useful. And I hope that makes the talks that I'll be dropping next Saturday a lot easier to understand when I talk about the two different platforms. You can contact me on Blue Sky or LinkedIn. But where I'd love you to go next, please, 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 is go to totallyAthing.substack.com and subscribe to my posts there. You can hit the like and subscribe to this one on YouTube. But you can also support this channel and my lectures by subscribing at the URL on your screen. Thanks for listening. I am Sarah Smith, and this has been Totally a Thing.